Hello and welcome to Sim.bc. Right now is 16:09 in the afternoon, and unfortunately, well, both unfortunately and happily, it is sunny outside. Yay! Which means that it's gonna be a beautiful day. It's gonna be a brilliant day. I'm gonna go for a nice little walk after this. Gonna clear me head in the sunshine. But the problem is that with this feed right here, my lamp can't overpower the sun, so it means that the lighting solution is going to be a bit odd because the webcam on the computer, is focusing on this over here. Unfortunately, not much I can do about that. Wow, yeah, exactly, now we're back. Not much I can do about that, unfortunately, even if I wanted to. I can't really power down the sun, and I can't power up my lamps to overpower the sun. If I could, I'd probably be a millionaire at this point. Billionaire, actually, and have the entirety of the human race at the mercy of my brilliance. It's exactly like it is anyway. No, it's not. To add on to the misery that I'm not the most brilliant mind of all time, or that the lighting solution isn't properly working for this feed, depending on how you see it, relative problem. But adding on to the misery is that I actually worked out my legs yesterday. And why did I do that? Now I have a hard time standing up. One of the days where I missed when I actually sat down and recorded, not just that it went quicker and was more easily accessible, more easy to set up and better for me in every single way except for the quality, but that doesn't really matter. That's not why you're here though, now is it? No. No. That is not why you're here. You're here right now because we're going to talk about... I'm always going to say economics, like we're talking about economics at this channel anymore. Am I right, people? Or management, for that matter. No. We're going to continue the project of what is evil. And in order to explore what is evil, we've gone through several stuff. Wow, that's concrete. We've gone through several theories. We've gone through several terms that we try to establish an understanding of what evil actually is. And yesterday we were looking at the psychology of evil, right? The TED Talk, the written understanding of it. And as many of you probably pointed out and know, it was a TED Talk that I linked, but it is in written form as well. It exists in written form, and that was what I read. And I actually realized that it was a TED Talk when I was done. Said it in the introduction as well of the article that I thought was an article. Anyway, mates, But we're going to look at some concrete theory today. And one of the concrete theories that we're going to look at, and more of an experiment, right, is the Milgram experiment. Let me give so what we're going to look at is the Milgram experiment. Unfortunately, I just had to check it out on my notes here, because I didn't quite remember if it was the Stanford prisoners experiment or if it was Milgram's experiment that we're going to take up today. But it is this Milgram experiment. And unfortunately, I can't move around all the things on my computer because I'm recording with it right now, so I can't actually move iMovie without interrupting the recording, and this is so not relevant to the action at all. So, moving on ahead. What is Milgram's experiment? Really? Well, the basis of it was that Milgram was meeting the critique, right? The criticism after the Second World War, where people in the US and Europe, for that matter, were saying that how could the Nazis, right? How could the Nazis actually follow these despicable orders that was a crime against humanity in all manner of ways? They were discriminating people, they were destroying people, they were actively making, actions that went against humankind and was actually criminal acts against humanity. How could people do something like that? And Milgram's hypothesis then was that, well, it's all based on authority and that someone is saying something to you. So if I take on a figure of authority and I go and tell you to do something, if you believe in my authority, the perceived idea of authority, you're more likely to go along with it without questioning it. So what they did then in order to try this out in the US and after the war, because people had so much critique towards during the war era, so to say, how could people actually act in such a way? And I highly recommend that you go and check this out for yourself. If I get something wrong, hope that I don't, fingers crossed that I don't, but you know, there is a human error inside there somewhere. Not with me and my enormous brilliance, right? But you know, in general it is. So, highly recommend you to apply a bit of source critique here. But Milgram basically took a sample of people, right? A sample of average Americans, middle-aged people, the middle of the entire society, from high into low, and just brought them in and put them in an isolated environment. Now, what they did after this with these people is that they took these people individually in the isolated environment-ish, or in a very, what you would say, a very experimental environment, a very controlled environment, to put them at the table. Now, every time that they were pushing a button, because they had a button, I believe, 1 or 2, they were going to give a person a shock. And the shock value was going to be increased every time they didn't answer correctly. And they had a figure of authority, someone who just stood there and claimed that they had the authority to actually perceive this experiment, someone who was actually supervising this experiment, telling them to push the button if they didn't get what they wanted, so to say, increasing the voltage for the other person on the other side of the spectrum. Now, it turns out that there was actually no one there. There were just some people who responded to what the button was supposed to do, right? So there wasn't actually anyone on the other side of the experiment. It was just one person pressing a button and then someone making a noise on the other side. However, this person who was in the experiment didn't know about this, right? So the person who was in the experiment didn't know that there actually wasn't anyone on the other side, and they fully truly believed that when they pushed the button, they were going to make someone electrocuted in a lesser or a higher manner, but giving them a bit of voltage, so to say, which isn't good, right? I think we all can agree with that isn't good. Especially since most of us, anyway, especially me who is from the countryside, has once or twice trying to jump a fence that was electrified and got semi-electrocuted, which isn't a good experience, right? Anyway, the experiment kept going on in such a manner that the one who had the perceived, the perceived authority was telling the person to increase the voltage for every time they didn't get the right answer, and the person sitting in the seat, so to say, was keep pushing the button. And when they came up to lethal doses, so to say, most of the people were looking towards their super advisor or their perceived super advisor to see, can I actually continue? This is a lethal dose that I can give them, a potentially lethal dose of injection here. Should I still keep going? And when and of course the person with the perceived authority was meant to say yes, keep on going, to see how far they could push the person who was in charge, I'd say, how far they could push the person who had the control over actually pushing the button to actually push the button, even though they were overseeing the recommended dosage of voltage. So in short, the person who had the perceived authority told the person in the chair to, yes, keep going, no matter if this can actually hurt him for real. And the person in the chair, I think it is something along the lines of 4 out of 5, actually, or if it was more than that, 5 out of 6, or something along those lines, actually kept on pushing the button, even though they were actually distributing a higher voltage to the other person on the other side. Now, yet again, there were nobody on the other side, but they thought that they were. They thought that they were giving a voltage to someone on the other side. Based on that, an authority figure, right? Someone with the authority said that they could. And this really freaked people out. The finding of this, right? The findings that this experiment brought to light really made people think about, would Americans do that as well? And it has been carried out in more or less extent ever since, in Europe, in Asia, and I think in South America. There was some links towards that in the end anyway, that I briefly checked out. So yet again, source critique, but they seem to arrive at the same kind of conclusions. And now they've been doing these kinds of tests in other manners, not specifically with voltage, but with other things that can hurt other people, and see how far along people would actually go. And yet again, the consensus of all of these studies that at least as I perceived it, right, the consensus seems to be that yes, people do tend to listen to a perceived authority figure, even like as long as they think that the figure of authority, has an established authority. Yet again, perception of authority. This does not necessarily mean that this person has the authority as they state that they do, but just that you yourself believe that they do. Many people, or most people, a qualified majority of people, would actually go along without questioning the authority, and even if they do question it, they would do it anyway. Which was horrifying to many people to see that, wow, it wasn't actually the Nazis who were like borderline crazy and all of them were evil. It's just that, well, people tend to act in such a way, in such a manner, that when we're given orders, we follow them if we believe that they come from a legitimate source. Which was an eye-opening experience, to say the least, at the time, and I would argue that it still is, because I can't really comprehend the findings of this study, right? I mean, to imagine that there are people out there who just blindly follows orders without actually questioning what is happening. And yet again, I can't say for myself that I'm not one of those people, because as far as I know, I haven't been put to a situation where that would be the case. And even if I have, well, then I might actually be one of them without actually knowing it. But it's horrifying in a way to think that people would act in such a way. But since we're talking about evil, how can we connect this to evil? Well, the point that I was trying to make, or the point that I was thinking about while reading this study was, does that mean that the people who don't question the perceived authority figure, does that mean that they're actually evil? Or does that mean that, as of yesterday, that what we discussed, that they're just a pacifist in this action, so to say? Sure, they are the one who pushes the button. Sure, they are the one who is delivering the high voltage. But technically, in their minds, they probably don't believe that they're the one who takes the decision. Even though they are the ones who pushes the button, they believe that they can blame the authority figure. That the authority figure is the one who has the responsibility over the person in the chair. So does that make them evil? Because I've read some critique towards this. People saying that, yeah, the people in the chairs are evil because they have their own... They can always make the decision not to. But simultaneously, can they really? If so many people do it, right? If so many people goes along with the perceived authority, then perhaps that means that somewhere inside of us, like in our brains, we're programmed to actually follow orders and listen to orders. Based on that, we're like, the pack animal. We have developed in packs, and that has grown up to be society. And based on that behavior, we're used to have, like biologically, we're used to have a strong leader or a couple of strong leaders that we follow. A theory, yet again, that I believe to be quite reasonable, right? Not necessarily true, but quite a reasonable one. But if that is true, then it might be the case that we're programmed, so to say, biologically programmed to actually listen to these kinds of cues, so to say, that we're used to listen to orders, we're focused to listen to orders, we're learned or taught to be listening to different orders. Which is kind of interesting, because that does that necessarily mean that I, who execute the evil deed or the untasteful deed, does that actually make me evil? And that was kind of a big debate that was taken up, because people were yet again referring to the Nazis. They're evil, right? They were doing bad stuff during the Second World War. That means that all of them are evil. Now, yet again, as with Hofstede, as with all of these things, when I generalize a huge array of population, you tend to making huge generalizations, huge mistakes that follows onto this statement. So if you look at all the Nazis, all of them weren't Nazis, right? All of them perhaps didn't share that political view. If you look at all the Nazis who did wrong things, all of them perhaps didn't do wrong things. And if you look at them, all of them probably didn't like what they were doing, but they did it anyway because of this. Not all of them, of course. Yet again, the 4 out of 5 given by the experiment, so all of them probably didn't do so and probably was punished accordingly, unfortunately. But many people probably did. Does this make them evil? Or does this make them just follow orders? And yet again, who is to blame in this situation? Is the perceived authority figure the one who is to blame for the evil act? Because this is the person who is, yet again, holding the responsibility over the group. Yet again, referring to perhaps the TMT, the top management team of that, well, that's the top political team, let's say, of that country. Are those the one to blame? Or are the people who really executed it to blame? Because it depends on how you view it, right? I mean, do you, how can I say this? Do Do you punish the policymakers who spreads the idea and spreads the seeds for what is going to become evil? Or do you punish the people who actually executes it? Because, for instance, right, if you, let's see if I can come up with a good example. If you see someone on the streets who are exercising their freedom of speech, their right to freedom of speech, right? And they're saying something that is quite despicable, something that some people would perceive to be evil, but they don't do anything, right? There's no physical action. They don't direct it towards a specific people, so it's not like hate speech, right? It's just that they state some things that isn't generally accepted based on that it's harmful in some way or fashion. Now, do we punish those people, or do we punish the people who listen to this and then acts based on these opinions and actually do something about it and acts out these things in reality? Who is the evil person? Is it both? Is it equal? Is it the one who executed it? It's the one who spread it? Yet again, going back to the Nazi regime idea, that is it the soldiers who executed it that are evil, or is it the people in charge who are actually evil? Going back to the Milgram experiment, then, is it the authority person, the perceived authority figure, who is the evil person in the room in this controlled environment? Yet again, so it might be a biased result, right? That is the one who says, well, I'm taking full responsibility because I forced you to do so. I didn't force you physically, but I kind of mentally said that I'm above you, right, in stature and position, and told you to do something, and you just followed orders. You just followed orders. Or are you the one who's sitting in the chair, the one who actually pushed the button to electrocute the person on the other side to an extent which is actually harmful and deadly? Are you the one who's evil because you're executing the act? Now, this is a really, really interesting discussion in my mind, and it's something that you'd probably be taking up at high school level, probably maybe even before that, taking it up in psychology at university level, actually trying to understand the nature and behavior of people. Yeah, it's just such an interesting take. But what is my opinion? Yeah, what is my conclusion of it? Well, I would say it's an equal part problem. The person who is the perceived figure, yeah, sure, they have their responsibility, and sure, they are spreading the knowledge, I'd say, they're spreading the know-how, spreading the notion of the evil, the evil ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have all of the responsibility on themselves, even though they have the perceived responsibility. It's equally as much on the person who acts, but the person who acts tends to have the ability to think critically about what they hear, and it's something that we should, of course, encourage to people, that they should be thinking more critically towards orders and stuff like that, right? Taking a bit more of an individualistic approach and just do what the collectivistic is doing. Might be biased because, Swedish shit again. Well, I'd say it's an equal distribution of evil. Maybe that if I'm forced to choose one over the other in a very absolutist perspective, that I would tend to skew towards the person who's actually executing it. And that's just because, as far as I know about the rights system and the judgment system and the legal system in Sweden goes, it's generally, when it comes to punish someone, the one who first strikes, like the one who involves a physical action of violence, who is the one who gets mistreated, so to say, or is the one who is on the downside, or the downscale, or whatever. It isn't skewed in their favor when it comes to the legal system in Sweden. So I might be biased when I'm thinking about gender and cultural caging, but I tend to think that it's basically even, but maybe it's a 49-51, right, towards skewing towards the responsibility of the one that's actually executing the action. Anyway, I talked about this for way longer than I thought I would. It's a really interesting topic. I would like to see what you think about it in the comment section below. Have a nice one, mates, and I'll see you tomorrow with the SNR, the internet's favorite show. See you tomorrow, mates. Bye.